Well, hello and welcome back, everyone. Um, this video is really addressing ChickMcn himself. It seems that the video that I did on why exactly the white replacement / genocide theory is a conspiracy really hit a nerve with him. And he was trying to debate me in the comments section. And one of the issues with this is that at the time, I wasn't feeling so great, and I had a lot of things going on, a lot of things to do. And I don't have like a giant platform, so like there's not like a bunch of people, dogpiling on bad arguments or whatever, like defending the position. And it's usually left up to me. But it's really hard to do when you have like 3 people trying to do mass debates with you in various comment sections at the same time, when you really just kind of want some peace and quiet. I know I could have just turned off the phone, but admittedly, I engaged in reactionary banter. Just, like it wasn't about debate. It wasn't about putting forward an argument. I just sort of reacted because I was frustrated. And I proceeded to type this out. I skimmed over him in reference to this Calgary person. I skimmed over him in order for anyone to make any kind of practical prediction. It must be done off of past and current trends. You cannot just assert that X will happen in the future and say, I know that because I'm right. What people are doing today is not at all different from the past. We really weren't separated by these cute little kingdoms and never dared to cross over into another. We've been breeding all over the place for centuries, and none of what this guy is saying has ever happened yet. This is the equivalency of the many times people have been freaking out about the end of the world and the coming of the apocalypse, and it has never come. Meanwhile, scientists are making accurate predictions based off of actual empirical data, based off of what we already know on how the universe functions, and we got better estimates of what the end of the world could look like, which turns out to be multiple things. At this point, I kind of think it is time for humans to stop existing, because we are a parasite, and that includes all of your silly, precious little races, all this quote-unquote intelligence, and not a clue on what to do with it. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that the reason why I'm so delicate and meticulous in using a word like race that is often used to describe a person's color. I'm not against the idea of obviously I understand there are different skin pigmentations. I have eyes, I can see this. From a genetic standpoint, though, the idea or the concept of race doesn't really exist. It's something that is completely aesthetic, referring to skin tone, eye color, and the way predominantly that your hair grows. Maybe there's some other attributes like in like the Chinese sort of Asian, not the India sort of Asian, like the way the eyes are, something like that. Most of this is just observable, superficial traits that don't really carry a whole lot of anything with them. They're just observable aesthetics of biology and not much else. Now, I think what ChickMcn oftentimes tries to do is, I think he was trying to make an argument that culture can be genetically identified, which it cannot. There's no genetic markers whatsoever that suggest cultural attachment of any kind. Culture absolutely is learned. Yes, if a white person was born and raised in China or the Middle East or in an African country somewhere, you would take on the aspects of that culture and their beliefs regardless of being white. There absolutely is no evidence. You can look at genetics until you're blind. You're not going to find a genetic marker tying you to a culture. Cultures are something that we make up. The other thing ChickMcn brings up, like, they stole the nuclear family from us. They're taking away our culture. And, I didn't mean to make an argument for civic nationalism. I'm not a fan of nationalism in general. I was just trying to be as objective as I could, and in looking at arguments or statistics and facts, not necessarily arguments that I agree with personally, but ones that I would say are probably more rational. I think what was missed here is that I was saying, if, from a philosophical standpoint, if culture is what you're worried about, skin pigmentation, or what people refer to as race, is the least relevant and the least concerning thing of it. It's a state of mind, it's a way of life, it's a practice, it's a philosophy, it's a societal influence, it's a lot of things that just cannot be found in genetics. It's a bunch of learned behaviors. There are some behaviors that are tied to genetics, but that's more in like the way that you laugh, the way that you cough, things like that, different temperaments or something that you inherited from genetically from your parents. And again, that's not a ethnic or racial thing. That's just that's more of a person to person thing. Your parents are individuals, and there's some genetic traits that you will inherit from them. That's how that works. There is no genetic marker for culture, though. None. So, if what you're really worried about is the American culture, then genetic lineage, like, whether you have the genetic... And I want to stay away from words like ethnicity and race, because that has become so confusing. Like, there's just all these different positions and approaches to what those words mean. It's become convoluted at this point. So, like, for sake of simplicity, I'm just gonna say this. Okay, so like you have things like skin pigmentation, whatever. Then you have things of like genetic lineage, like and that's again something I'm not even interested. I'm not interested in genetic lineage, and people love to do that. They love to go around and say, well, I'm German, Austrian, Hungarian, or I my genetic lineage is of European descent, of English, French, Irish, Scottish, or genetic lineages of some place in Africa, some feel like Africa, there's multiple countries, but it gets sort of divided into South Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Northern Africa. So, people do that. They try and derive identity from their genetic lineage as far as where their ancestors lived at one point, or cultural aspects that their ancestors might have engaged in that we really don't today. The fact of the matter is, Mr. ChickMcn, the nuclear family idea is just, it's a fairy tale. It doesn't exist. There certainly were problems back in the 1950s, and one of the big reasons why my dad's generation rebelled against it is because it was so uniform and conformatively restrictive that the reality that they were being exposed to was in stark contrast to what society was telling them that reality was. This picturesque, perfect America of the nuclear family, the mom staying at home, taking care of the children, and yet so many people were still being exposed to domestic violence and domestic abuse and rape and adultery and all kinds of things. And so it was like, what are you talking about? And so if you want to know, it wasn't the left. It wasn't people with different skin pigmentations. It wasn't people who approximate their identity to their genetic lineages from ancestors of the past that destroyed it. It was, from ChickMcn's perspective, it was honestly white people themselves, because honestly, cultures evaporating into the distance and disappearing is another thing. It's been going on for centuries. And it's because the people within the society change society. Sometimes new things come along and they're not very good ideas, and those usually sort of taper off. But sometimes society comes up with new and innovative ideas, and they are better than what we've been doing before, and they take on the role of becoming the new norm for society, thus changing it. One of the reasons just for an example of the state of rebellion of what ChickMcn's talking about, one of the reasons why my husband's mom decided that she was going to reproduce with somebody who had a different skin pigmentation than herself was specifically because because the family that she was growing up in was so controlling and oppressive. They had all that uniformity, conformity, think the way that we tell you to think. So that 1950s conformity bullshit aspect. They became so restrictive and were extremely, well, I don't know, extremely. They were racist. They were trying to teach her to be racist. They were trying to teach her to have principles of bigotry towards different people, predominantly of minority status, especially at that time. That, when she started actually interacting with people that had a different skin pigmentation other than white, she realized, as often many of us do that do interact with, in a multicultural, where you're surrounded by people of different genetic lineages, that there's just things that are inherently human. And a lot of the things that we chalk up to being, well, the group of people with this skin pigmentation gravitate towards these things. Well, we learn pretty quick those are gross overgeneralizations, and they don't apply. Certainly not all the time. Mostly not all the time. And that the idea of individual choice, taste, and preference often gets ignored in this sort of tribalistic mindset. And you learn these people, well, they're just people just like you. And they're really not different, other than the observable trait of, oh, their skin is a different color, or their hair is a little bit different, their eye color's darker, or whatever. But she reproduced with this person with a different skin pigmentation, just as a giant middle finger to her family, because they were too unbearably controlling to tolerate. So, some of the destruction, not destruction, but moving out of that state of mind of cultural being from the 1950s, a lot of that was white people rebelling against other white people with really restrictive and controlling ideas that, as I said, as people push the envelope and they go outside the pale and realize, well, a lot of the stuff that I've been told it's bullshit. And that's kind of what happened to the 1950s. Is their kids, the baby boomers, they rebelled and invented the 1960s, which provoked a lot of social change and a lot of social reform. And like I said, as people started talking to and interacting with these people with a different skin tone, we really, I think people started realizing these people are not different. You can draw differences culturally, but they were born and raised here in the United States. They weren't really that different. And even when you take somebody from a different culture and you put them here, like I said, there are things that are just intrinsically human, and despite coming from a different culture, there's still commonalities to be found because, at the end of the day, we're both human. We're all just human. We pretty much all have the same psychological and physical needs. Not pretty much, we do. It's universal. This notion or concept of trying to separate and differ, really engage, like it's tribalism is what it is. It's you're saying that tribe is different for the sake of saying that they're different just because they're in another tribe, and you're ignoring aspects that just make them human. And this is what I mean. I'm trying to stay. I don't want to use words like ethnicity and race. Personally, from a genetic standpoint, there really is no such thing as race. Not in the human species. And ChickMcn brings up breeds and stuff like that. No, a 0.1% genetic variance is too low. It's too low for different speciation, for different breed, for different. Well, and I think race was something that was probably invented by people who wanted to be racist. And the problem with that is then now we're denying that these people with different skin tones are inherently human, and we do share the same psychological and physical needs. And then the only difference that's left is the genetic lineage. from a country, because their ancestors lived in a different country that had a different culture, which there's no genetic information for. And since if they're growing up here in the United States, they're going to adopt United States culture. And the reason why we have microcultures within the United States, or like fractal cultures that have been differing cultures within the culture itself, is predominantly, well, I mean, you look at the Black community. Some might say, well, it has a different culture than the white community within the United States. Well, you have to think for a very, very long time, they were ostracized from the white community. So, given human nature, they would adopt or adapt a different... What they adapted was a variant of the culture that already existed. But as those things disappear and we move on forward, more and more we see that the dominant culture still becomes the cultural relevancy to even people with different skin pigmentations, because we're being more inclusive. Now, ChickMcn, you are a racist, okay? You are a racist, hands down. I'm not saying that you're a neo-Nazi. I'm not going to say that you're an ethno-nationalist, or that you're a white nationalist, or that... I think when it comes to white supremacy, you are a white supremacist, in the sense that when it comes to Black people versus white people, I think that you think white people are superior to Black people. And I think it's really funny that we look at things like an IQ test that was given to a group of people that have been isolated from civilization, like people who live in tribes. And they go, aha, look, white people are smarter. Well, how about doing an IQ test on people with Black skin pigmentation that have had access to the same educational system that a very smart white person had, in comparing the two? I think then that line gets so fuzzy, it's not even there. Some of the the tribes in Africa, you're talking about people that have never been in an educational system at all. They've just been living out in the wilderness of Africa, and you go up to them and you ask them something about the Eiffel Tower. Why would they know anything about that? Why would they have a high IQ if they've never had education? Why would they? Why would you expect that? That's bizarre. And then, the argument is that the IQ is adjusted for that. The IQ test is adjusted for that. And it's not. It's not. That's why it's a bell curve. And that's why people who had a high IQ in the early 90s now have an expected average IQ in comparison with what people are scoring on IQ tests in more modern times, because now they're scoring higher IQ scores, which is changing the IQ average, which means if you had like an IQ of 113 back in the 80s, you probably now have an IQ of 80. So, yeah, education does make a difference. It is based on education. How on earth else do you measure this? This is a soft science. It's not a hard science. It's it's not something you can do empirically. It just isn't. There are certain aspects that we can look at that indicate, well, this person seems to be really good at kinesthetic learning or auditorily learning. But overall IQ, no. There's no way to really do it. And you are talking about a social science. It's a soft science. It's not. It's really hard to produce something that's concrete. It's why the overall general consensus in the psychological community is that IQ tests are being used inappropriately, and they're not being. It's being taken too seriously, which wasn't the purpose or intent of the IQ test. A lot of psychologists don't even like giving them anymore. But yes, ChickMcn, you are a racist. I am not. I don't really care about skin pigmentation, and I go as far as to not even care about ethnicity, or what people refer to as ethnicity, I guess. I'm not really sure. But when they talk about their genetic lineage, it's like, oh yeah, my ancestors were Welsh or Germanic or Native American or this, that, and the other. That's completely irrelevant. As I've put it, I'm more fixated on who I personally identify as an individual. I don't really care what my ancestors identified as. I don't care. And of course, I'm going to have a American inclination towards, culturally leaning towards, and culturally influenced by Enlightenment philosophy because, well, I was born and raised in America. So, of course. And as I've gotten older and I've been introduced to a very, very broad stroke of different academic disciplines and a variety of educational values, I've learned about cultural aspects and philosophies and ways of thinking that come from other cultures. Absolutely. But that doesn't necessarily mean I always agree with them just because it's different than my own. It gives me the ability to look on them from an outsider's perspective and say, well, I like this one for these reasons, and I don't like this one for these reasons. And it's really hard to do that on your own culture because there's an immediate bias. And that's just fact. But ChickMcn, seriously, if you were born in the Middle East, it doesn't matter what skin pigmentation or genetic lineage you have. If you were born in the Middle East, you would undoubtedly be Muslim. You wouldn't just pop out and go, Christianity. No, it's not how that works. And if culture, something like that, was genetically proposed, if it had a genetic tie, then every white person would automatically be born as pagan. That would be the default genetic position. But it's not, because, guess what? Lo and behold, it's learned. And I've pointed this out before. I find it very fascinating that you would even think that, considering that Christianity itself is a Middle Eastern religious philosophy. It is. All three Abrahamic religions are. Judaism, Islam, Christianity, they're Middle Eastern. Your genetic lineage and what your ancestors did, what culture they participated in and were brought up in, has nothing to do with the culture you currently possess. If you were to talk to some of your ancestors, they probably engaged and participated in things that you would personally find to be deplorable, because society culturally has changed, not from outside influence, but because the people within the culture have wanted change. You know, we ultimately get to a point where we ask questions like, why are we treating women this way? Are they not human? Why are we treating people that have different skin pigmentations the way that we do? Are they not human? We start asking ourselves, is this ethical? Is this moral? Is there a better way to do things? Why are we required to dress a certain way? What is it? Why has society made arbitrary decisions on what is professional and unprofessional? And sometimes we even move forward to go backwards, like piercings, for example, used to not be acceptable. Now today it's more acceptable than it was back in the 50s, the 1950s. But really, we move forward to go backwards, because you go far enough back in time, piercings and tattoos were the norm. This is cultural shifts, and they're cultural shifts that have occurred in, for ChickMcn's sake, white people. And I think that there's a really big problem when you're not open to knowledge and looking at the history that we've found. I mean, you go and look up and be broad and academic studies. It's not just things that have occurred within just the 20th and 19th century. Look at the mummy that we found of Utsi. He was somewhere in Italy. He had tattoos. He had a very, very different culture than what we do today. And if you lived in Utsi's culture, you'd probably be very, very unhappy. And the concept of Christianity, or what you understand ChickMcn to be as God, would have been completely foreign concepts to Utsi. So no, these wild and vivid conspiracy theories are lacking in substance. It's just jumping to the nearest conclusion based on looking at patterns. I mean, we're pattern-seeking animals, but just because you see a pattern doesn't mean that's actually what's there. It's like looking up at the stars. It's like, oh, I see the shape of a bunny rabbit, therefore it must be. Your mind is doing that. So no, ChickMcn, there's no genetic markers indicating culture or cultural inheritance. None. That doesn't exist. That's not a thing. The reason why the Chinese have the culture they do is not because they are Chinese. Somebody who came from Asia and has lived in the United States, especially several generations down, is going to have more in common with our culture here in the United States than they're going to have in common with people from Britain and their culture, or France and their culture, or even people from China. It's undoubtedly proven. Culture is learned. I think a lot of the times people seek out their ancestors' culture as a means of an identity crisis. They're seeking an identity. And that's what I mean is I've rejected this stuff, and this seems to be very, very difficult for a lot of people to do. They can't do it. I'm not worried about it. I don't care about my ancestors and what they did or what culture that they participated in. I'm interested in the now and the things that I personally am interested in based on my tastes, choices, and preferences. I don't really care how much of me is European descent or native descent or how much African descent I have. I'm not really interested. I don't care. It's irrelevant. And that's probably a concept that is very, very, very much beyond your ability to grasp. And don't worry, even other non-racialized people have a hard time grasping that. Even other non-racist, very anti-fascist, leftist people that I talk to, they love looking at their ancestry because they're clinging to some form of identity. But I guess the best way to put it is, I create my own identity. And I'm just as much capable of accepting things in the current culture that we live in, as well as criticizing certain aspects of the culture we live in, and disliking certain aspects of the culture we currently live in. And that's the criticism and the dislike is not something that is unique to me. There's a lot of people, and I personally don't care about skin color, so that includes people of different skin pigmentations that live within this culture, that we seem to like the same aspects, we seem to criticize the same aspects, and we seem to dislike the same aspects, and there's a lot of people that do that. And this is where the push for change comes from, is asking the question like, hey, couldn't this be done a little better? It doesn't have to be this way. It is this way because it's expected. Because we're told, well, that's the way it's done. That's not a good argument. There are things that could be done differently, and that doesn't mean that they'll be better. It also doesn't mean that they'll be worse. And the ones that turn out to be worse, we stop doing them. And the ones that turn out to be better, well, those are the ones that we keep. And that's ultimately what changes society and culture. we say, well, this is better. It's more humane. It's more egalitarian. It's more ethical. It's more moral. And that's what we do. I know I'm probably a monster to you, ChickMcn. And I'm sorry you feel that way. But I'm not a racist. I don't care about skin pigmentation. And I don't advocate for anyone to be racist. And a great example of cultural change is that, well, Japanese culture used to be very, very close to Chinese culture a long time ago. Not anymore. Japanese culture has a lot more in common with Western culture now than it did during the time before the World Wars. Cultures change. And it's not reliant on your ancestry, your genetic lineage. And it's not reliant on your skin pigmentation, which I think you correlate a lot of those things together. And you call that common sense. It's like, well, I can't think of a better example of, that old adage. Can't see the forest for the trees. It's like you saying, like, it's common sense. I mean, it's right there in front of my eyes. I don't need a scientist to tell me those are trees, and I'm sitting there, well, it's a forest. Like, no, you're being weird. It's trees. Well, no, it's a forest. I mean, disrespect, but understand you're not going to get me to look through a racialized lens. That's just not how I operate. To me, that is illogical and kind of stupid. No offense. But I see no reason to do that. People are just people. Just people. And most of us are just trying to make the best out of what we got while we're here before we die. We're just trying to live our life. That's it. Eat, sleep, fall in love, have sex, reproduce, whatever. I highly doubt this will change your mind on anything, but I at very least want to apologize for the reactionary comments. Sorry. But with that, I'm out.